Hello and welcome. My name is Barkha Dutt, and you're watching the Mojo Story, our independent digital platform that does a deep dive into the biggest issues of our time. Today, we'll be looking at a damning new report by US based think tank, the Hudson Institute, that is talking about growing Khalistani activity on American soil. Let's bring up our big focus on the program this evening. A new report out by the Hudson Institute in the United States of America is talking about Khalistani groups and Khalistani separatists gaining new ground in the United States of America. Co-authored by South Asia experts at the Hudson Institute, the report speaks of a Pakistan destabilization playbook when it comes to India, saying that the template being followed is similar to the one that was deployed with Kashmiri separatist groups. In fact, the report speaks of how the Americans are softballing the issue, given that these separatist groups are disguising themselves with what the report calls ostensibly peaceful pro-Khalistan protests. The report is urging the Americans to pay closer attention and not make the same mistakes they did with Kashmiri groups. In fact, they're saying that these groups should be investigated and looked at through the prism of terror financing. Of course, the Pakistan deep state link is at the forefront, and as we said, the Hudson Institute report mentions specifically a destabilization playbook that could be the precursor to what the report warns could be a new wave of violence in Punjab. That is our focus on the program today. Is the threat from a resurgent Khalistani movement active on American soil something that the world is taking as seriously as it should? Let's introduce our guests on the program today. Let's bring them up. We're joined by Tavleen Singh, veteran journalist who spent many years on the ground in Punjab through the worst years of militancy. We're also joined by Dr. Aparna Pande. She is the lead author on that report, along with several other experts at the Hudson Institute, and Ambassador Singh joining us from Punjab today, veteran diplomat, also the founder of a new munch in Punjab with an ear to the ground. I think will be able to give us a sense on how much is a fact and how much is fiction and how much is politicized when it comes to this question around a resurgent Khalistani sentiment. Aparna, let me start by bringing you in. You and your fellow authors at the Hudson Institute have spoken about how this resurgent Khalistani activity is presented as peaceful protests, as free speech, and so on, but how it is actually much more insidious, and that this is the template that the Pakistani deep state followed even when it came to Kashmiri separatist groups. Talk a little bit about the key findings in this report.
Thanks, Barkha. Actually, so the report which we brought out, Hudson actually prides itself on looking forward, right, and anticipating. That's what we are supposed to do. And so when we did sort of in previous years look at how the Kashmiri activists, which were supported, many of them who were ostensibly supported by the Pakistani deep state, acted. In our report, we talk about Ghulam Nabi Fai and the Kashmir American Foundation. And we saw a similar playbook being used with respect to many of the larger pro-Khalistani separatist activists in the United States. When you look at where their funding comes from, when you look at joint activities by Khalistani groups and Kashmiri groups for the last few years. And while there have been activists in the US since the 1980s on Khalistan, the last 4-5 years have seen a rise in this activism. They organize joint protests, they organize joint events, they are present at similar events outside the Indian embassy or when an Indian delegation comes. And so what our report wants to do is two things. One, show that over the years, the Pakistani deep state has invested and has supported the Khalistani movement, not just in India, but in the diaspora. And two, that if it is simply a Khalistani movement, which is a group which is talking about democracy, then, well, this is a democratic country and you can't do anything about it. But if there are activists who are providing, who have either received support from the Pakistani deep state or are supporting activism or militancy inside India, then the United States government should act against them. And so we have a list of recommendations for the US government. Include all groups responsible for terror attacks in India, including Khalistani groups, in the list of designated global terror groups. Designate as terrorists the various individuals that Indian and American intelligence and law enforcement believe are connected to designated terrorist entities. Apply
let's. Yeah, I want to get to the terror financing in a moment from now. Sure. But when you talk about terror financing, the report gives the example of Ghulam Nabi Fai, and those of us who've grown grey covering conflict in the Kashmir Valley do remember the Fai scandal, as it were, very well. This is a man who assimilates himself into the mainstream of the US sort of strategic affairs community, but is being bankrolled by the Pakistani deep state. Finally gets prosecuted, to that extent he's busted, but he's somebody who's actually shared the stage with established Khalistani sympathizers, and your report goes into that interconnectedness of the Kashmir and the Khalistan project when it comes to Pakistan. So can you speak a little bit about that?
So what we did was that a group of people, we had, Christine Fair, we had Michael Rubin from American International Institute, and we had two data in sort of researchers. They actually went through IRS data. They went through FARA, or, the sort of, when you become a registered lobbyist, you need to register yourself. So they went through all that data. They checked who was sort of, where did the funding come from? And in most cases, what they realized was that Kashmiri and Khalistani groups got funding from similar people. They had similar contributions. So we looked at about 55 groups which were linked to each other. And most of these groups, are not as big as the Sikhs for Justice, for example. Just a side note, since the report came out, all of us contributors are receiving 100 emails every hour from sort of, I would call them bots, who are basically emailing us to protest the fact that we've actually brought out a report.
And what are they saying? And what are they saying? Are they saying we are not Khalistanis and you're smearing us, or are they saying something else?
So it basically says that, it's called My Contribution Towards Pro-Khalistan NGO's $1 million pledge for Afghanistan. Is the exact same subject, exact same email, and apparently, ostensibly, it is addressed to the UN Secretary General, but it's the exact same email. And it goes, and even the Sikhs for Justice, Pannun, the tweet which you are showing, the same email I got as well, and all of us got it. So it's their attempt. I mean, if that's all they can do is, email and try and spam my email, then I don't think it's going to make an impact.
But it speaks to something being organized, the fact that you've all been spammed with identical emails, to a larger sort of puppeteer's hand at the back. And I'm very intrigued by this idea of 55 groups being interconnected. Now, I want to just bring in Tavleen and Casey for a domestic perspective. Tavleen, this has been, in a sense, at the heart of your journalism, covering the insurgency, the conflict, the extremist years in Punjab. And, I just wonder, we've had a lot of debate around Khalistan, very unfairly sometimes, when the farmers were out protesting. But you also saw from those farmers a sort of, a creature like Deep Sidhu emerged from the heart of it, who very openly, brazenly, unapologetically defended Bhindranwale, for example, and then that was used to smear the larger peaceful protest. When you look at this, the findings of this report, and the urging by the Hudson Institute that, listen, it may look like peaceful demonstrations right now, but something else is brewing here. What goes through your head? Are you convinced? I know you have a ear to the ground in Punjab as well. Are you convinced that Khalistan is resurgent in sentiment?
Look, I have two ways of looking at this. One, I believe that the Indian government has, raised this bogey a little too much. So we had at one point Greta Thunberg and Disha Ravi charged with Khalistani, Now that is something that the Indian government must stop doing, because it is a fact that on the ground in Punjab, if you go into the Darbar Sahib in Amritsar, you have Pindrawale posters everywhere, and there is a support for him. There has always been there. Secondly, after the attack, after Operation Blue Star, a lot of the people who escaped from the Golden Temple actually went to New York. I had a taxi driver who recognized me, and it was terrifying. Recognized me from the Golden Temple, and he was, one of Pindrawale's followers. So those people have been rendered, unemployed after the movement, happened, and many of them are in New York, but they only become effective if they have support in Punjab. Now, I don't know whether you know that Operation Blue Star was the beginning of the real movement for Khalistan. Until then, it was just silly little passports being distributed. After Pindrawale was killed, it became after the Akal Takht was pulled down, because the Akal Takht is the political symbol of the Sikhs. There is only one, and when that happened is when it started. Now I don't see that kind of trigger happening yet, but if we have one more year of the farmers' issues not being settled, who's to know what can happen? Who's to know what can happen? Because actually there are political parties who secretly, back these guys. There are in the gurdwaras. There's always some sort of, hanky panky going on. So actually, what the government of India needs to do, I read the report. The report's, convincing, but these are all irrelevant groups as long as the ground in India remains infertile for them to occupy. And I'm sorry, but this particular government has tried to create a very fertile space for them by, raising bogeymen.
So I'm intrigued to hear you say that if the farmers protest, and even today we've had the Akali leaders detained, the farmers protest continues. It's a highly political conversation now. It's traveled also now into Haryana and Uttar Pradesh. You've seen the Badals today. Take out a major procession in solidarity with the farmers. So it continues to simmer. Ambassador K.C. Singh, do you agree that what matters is really what the sentiment is on the ground in Punjab? Or do your alarm bells, because of your training as a senior diplomat, also go off when you read Aparna and her co-author's report about how, we think Khalistan and the entire sort of danger of it is buried firmly in the past, and here's a report that's warning you it may not be. Well, if Pakistan will certainly try, then it should not be.
Barkha, 3-4 things. I largely agree with Tavleen, but let's contextualize it. The old scars are there in Punjab, but I don't think anybody relates them to an active Khalistan movement. Yes, the central government, they were foolish. They thought they could dub it as a Khalistan movement and go after the farmers. On 26th of January, I think that is the dividing line. This farmers' agitation almost died that evening because of Sidhu and the other people for what they did at the Red Fort. Essentially, the agitation was over. Now, if at that stage, Taket had not come in, and I think what happened thereafter is it got de-Sikhized. It's no longer a Sikh agitation. It's no longer a Haryana, Punjab agitation. It's the complete Jat community, the farming community from Punjab onto Haryana into Western UP. So there is great unity there. In fact, many times on issues like water have been raised. They said, but Haryana is not getting water from Punjab. The Jats of Haryana said, forget it. That's not an issue. We will discuss waters when it comes to it. You talk about the farm laws. So after 26th of January, it's got secularized. It's completely a Jat agitation, a farming agitation. And the central government's attempt to make it as one community, as Khalistanis including it, that just collapsed. And I think we have Taket to thank for that. If that had not happened, the only faces that the agitation had were Sikh faces, because Haryana did not have any noticeable non-Sikh Jat leader. The Chautalas were part of the government. And Gurnam Singh Chuduni, who's one of the two prominent leaders of Haryana, is also a Sikh. So therefore, you did not have a prominent non-Sikh Jat leader who could become the face of the agitation. So therefore, that is no longer in play. But there are 2 or 3 other things. One is the election coming up in Punjab. Last time also, normally 5 years ago, what happened is AAP were playing this very, very dangerous game. They were getting funds from abroad. Now, when the funds were coming in, they were coming in with an intent, because you remember there was a referendum 2020, and that election was 3 years before that. Now, the 2020 got mixed up in all the COVID situation, so they postponed it to 2022. But I don't think even 2020 really resonated in Punjab. Now, therefore, you have to distinguish between what the expatriate, what the Sikh diaspora is up to, and what the Sikhs in Punjab are up to. So there is a disconnect there. And Pakistan
But sometimes is there an overlap? Sorry, complete your point about Pakistan,
Yeah.
and then I want to say that when there are people's movements, how do you
Right.
monitor where every paisa is coming from? How do you know? Even what happened with young Disha Ravi. I mean, at some point, I think there was a bunch of them exchanging WhatsApp or emails, and they did not know the background, or so their lawyers said, did not know the background of everybody they were talking to, which is what happens in big mass movements.
No, correct. So two things. One is, I'll come to this later, but if you go back to the 80s, the agitation in Punjab and incitement of the Sikhs preceded the incitement of the Muslims in Kashmir. Because while they were inciting Sikhs here, they were busy in Afghanistan. Now, once the Russians left, the Soviet Union left Afghanistan in 88, then they started pumping things into Kashmir. So the two were interconnected. One preceded the other. Now, the drones bringing weapons, Punjab government saying that they have a number of instances where drones have brought weapons, drugs, money, etc. So they're trying to disrupt that. But that is a new way of sending things across. So there is an attempt by Pakistan, there's no doubt. So they will do it abroad, they're doing it here, they will attempt it. The second one is the parties. I don't think that kind of money is coming in this time as yet. 2 or 3 times I've gone on Prime Asia, which is a major channel for the diaspora. And one of the last things I said is, for God's sake, don't send money to Punjab. We don't need your money to go to the politicians' pockets or people who promise you things. We need money. If you've got a good government in Punjab, send money for Punjab's development there. So you can drive it there. So it's a small group. They've captured certain gurdwaras in US and in Canada. For them, it's roji roti, because all the money is collected there. So they'll keep using the Khalistani bogi to keep their grasp over that. And these are boys who went there in the 90s. And they managed to, displace older, more sensible leadership. So it's a problem which India has not dealt with directly. It's something a mission should be dealing with. It's something which the governments need to deal with. So there is a problem in America that America needs to deal with. But I think at the moment, we are nowhere near any crisis situation in Punjab. And I don't think the farmers' agitation is going to get affected by it.
Okay, I think that's fair that we're not at a crisis point, but I think as Aparna said, that they are in the business of trying to anticipate fault lines, anticipate fissures, and look at what the report calls the Pakistan destabilization playbook. Now, Aparna, you and your researchers were looking specifically at the Khalistani groups, the interconnectedness with Kashmir and so on. But we've also had these developments take place in Afghanistan in the meantime. Can you speak a little bit to what happens to this Pakistan destabilization group, given that you've probably never seen the ISI as emboldened as it probably feels at this moment? And what that could do, I think one line in your report says that ostensibly peaceful pro-Khalistan demonstrations cannot be taken lightly, because they could be the precursor to a new wave of violence in what you say is the Indian state of Punjab. So go ahead and expand on that.
So 3 quick things, Barkha. One, we all know that in the 1990s, Pakistan used Afghan territory for groups which were targeting in Kashmir primarily. Even though the Taliban have quote unquote said that their territory will not be used, that doesn't mean that is actually what is going to happen. So we have all those groups which are there. But an emboldened Pakistan, a Pakistan which yes, from the 1950s and 60s, they have supported insurgency inside India. But from 1971 onwards, the Pakistan military has wanted to revenge Bangladesh, revenge the loss of Bangladesh. And so in that sense, what has happened in Afghanistan is in some ways their way of taking revenge for what they saw as keeping Indian influence out of Afghanistan. the sort of the impact we see is threefold. What is very interesting is that the US based Khalistani groups, which are close to the Pakistani deep state, they bring out letters, or they send letters tied to what is Pakistan's security sort of view. And I'll give an example. Last year, the Sikhs for Justice sent letters to President Putin, President Xi, and Prime Minister Imran Khan, all three of them asking for support for referendum 2020 and for the Khalistan movement. The emails we have just received from bots basically is a pledge by these pro-Khalistani groups to give $1 million in aid to Taliban in Afghanistan. So it's very interesting. Why would you want to give aid to a sort of, to groups and entities which have nothing to do with your cause? The map of most of these pro-Khalistani groups, which are tied at some level to Pakistan, their maps of Khalistan do not include Pakistani Punjab. They only include Indian Punjab.
Interesting. What more do we know about this so-called Sikhs for Justice? What more do we know about it?
So, sort of what we know is sort of it is a group which was set up, by Gurmeet Singh, Gurpatwan Singh Pannu. It is ostensibly a group which sort of says that it is being set up for a referendum 2020. There isn't much information available publicly, but if we follow what they do, sort of all his activities, where he's present, where his groups, sort of hold events, all of them are tied to groups which are related to, which are tied to Kashmiri outfits. Now, there is no direct public link, but what we have found out is that they organize joint events, share the same lawyers, share the same donors. Now, I will clarify, they have not been accused of any crime, and we don't have any sort of any evidence that there's any unlawful activity. That isn't what a think tank can do. We can only go by what we find in the open source data. That is something which we would like.
I mean, we're seeing Ghulam Nabi Fai, and you made the point that you saw he's visible at many of these pro-Khalistan events, right?
So in 2011, he was indicted, if you recall, about 10 years ago. And then, he served his sentence, then he was released. And so he's back out. He has a new organization which sort of again sends emails periodically about Kashmir. But he and sort of, the Sikhs for Justice, and then there's a Kashmir Khalistan Action Front, which we also mentioned. Number of these hold joint events. Some of them share accountants, some of them share protests. But that's what we've been able to find about them.
Yeah. So let's come back to Casey and Tavleen. Tavleen, I mean, I think that the important thing is that you can't have this Khalistan bogey, but at the same time, you can't ignore the fact that this would be a kind of perfect agenda for Pakistan, especially in emboldened Pakistan at this point, given what's happened in Afghanistan. And of course, it's god-awful because as we've seen, even through the COVID pandemic, at the forefront of humanitarian relief have been gurdwaras who are conducting oxygen langars, both the courage and the compassion of the Sikh community that places seva at the heart of everything they do is well known. But then you have groups like these that become an excuse for others to smear an entire community. How concerned are you with some of these simmering tensions, with an election now just a few months away, with the farmers' protest unresolved, and with a very triumphalist Pakistan?
Look, I get these letters from the Sikhs for Justice. I've never even taken them seriously because they're so ridiculous, those letters, that, they're really, they're like the notes of a madman. So I've never taken them seriously. And after this report, I'm going to start taking them more seriously. But I actually believe that what we should be worrying about much more is what the Pakis are going to get up to in Kashmir. I'm really worried about that because, you see, you've got that kind of, the whole point about what they're doing in Afghanistan is for them to destabilize Kashmir. Now, there can be, and in Kashmir, you've got very fertile territory. You've got the Kashmiris very, very angry with what has happened. There's been no outreach to them. So, I would be much more worried about what's going on there than what's going on in the Punjab. In Punjab, I really don't see I mean, unless they bring down the Akal Takht or something again, or, send troops into some Gurdwara, I don't see a trigger in Punjab.
What do you think? How do you think the anger that is shaping up in the farmers' protests is going to manifest itself? And I mean, I'm not linking the farmers' protest to Khalistan. I'm just saying when popular anger remains unresolved, and I take Casey's point that the protest is now de-Sikhified. It's actually, its epicenter is Western Uttar Pradesh right now. It's more Jat-led. But the fact is that villages across Punjab have continued to, on a rotational basis, send 2 men from each house, each family. You know this, both of you know this, to the protests. It's not over for them. And when popular anger foments in that way, it can be manipulated sometimes. Tavleen?
The government of India must settle the farmers' issue, because it's not just now Sikhs. You've got Hindu, Muslim, Sikh. The Jats and the Muslims are made up in Western UP, and you've got Allahu Akbar, Har Har Mahadev type slogans going on. So what really worries me about the Modi government is that they don't seem to see the cussedness, and I can say this because I'm a Sikh myself, of the Sikh. When it comes to this kind of thing, they can be really cussed. They're not going to compromise now. So why don't they just say, okay, we will withdraw these laws at the moment. Let's just go back to the drawing board and talk about what you feel reform is needed. You tell us, let's start again. I think that's very, very important, because otherwise you're going to gradually create, and with the Punjab elections coming and all that, and UP elections, there are plenty of bad people ready to create trouble in Punjab and in Kashmir.
Yeah, I would agree with that. Casey, would you agree that there is a simmering cauldron? It's not boiling over. There is nothing tactile to hold on to right now, but it's like trouble is, could be brewing because of a whole bunch of issues, and election season, and a triumphalist Pakistan, and I agree with Tavleen, Kashmir has always been the end game. Khalistan has always been almost an enabling little instrument in that, as far as Pakistan is concerned. Casey?
Barkha, what I said earlier, what the farmers' agitation has done, now they cannot sustain the agitation unless Haryana hosted them. Those villages don't give them the milk. They are the ones most inconvenienced near the 2 borders in Tikri and Singhu, but they are giving full support there. So therefore, it is complete unity, this side of Yamuna, that side of Yamuna, and across the Gaggar between Punjab and Haryana. So make no mistakes, there is no separate Sikh sentiment on it. All that has happened is the anger is focused on BJP. So they are not letting BJP hold meetings in Haryana. They are not letting BJP people come out and do any kind of politicking in Punjab. And essentially, because of elections in Punjab and UP, the farmers are saying, let's defeat BJP there. So there is no Khalistan in it. I don't see where that comes in. And
so when you see Aparna's report, what occurs to you? You're not concerned right now that any...
No.
Yeah.
There's a disconnect. What those people are doing there, it's in their minds. Khalistan is something which exists in the mind of a part of the diaspora. You need to deal with it there. And if there is something where you can establish money, now look at how foolish can it be to be sending money to Taliban. Sikhs are fleeing Afghanistan. The last 10 or 15 in Jalalabad say they don't want to give up the Gurdwara there. They're feeling unsafe there. And the Sikhs sitting in America, having a good time, want to collect the money and send it to the Taliban. Do they even realize what they're doing? So it's so absurd. You think the Punjabis will even empathize with something like this? You're not sending money. The other thing is, I don't see the kind of funds coming into Punjab as yet. And so we have to keep, telling the people this. Don't send money. And if you recall, one of the reasons that AAP failed last time, they had a tremendous lead in Punjab. They took money from these people. And I remember Kejriwal went and spent a night in the home of a guy who was linked to militancy. My good friend P.S. Gill, who was the DGP before that and who was a candidate from Moga, he rang me up. He says, if you know anybody in AAP, tell them not to do it because they are staying at the house. He's staying at the house of someone whose people connected to whom killed his father, because his father, Nachhatra Singh, had been killed by the militants. So it's this kind of stupidity which cost AAP the election. So I think, therefore, they are wiser. The public opinion just shifted in Punjab away from AAP. Now, if it happened then, it's not going to happen. It'll happen again if people they take that kind of money. Barkha, two of her thugs are outside Punjab. Yeah. What Khalistan are these morons talking about? You already lost Nankana Sahib and Kartwarpur Sahib, and now you lose Patna Sahib and Hazur Sahib. So two of those thugs will be outside your so-called Khalistan, and you'll be landlocked small version of Afghanistan. It's a brainless, scatterbrained scheme. You know, the Sikhs have an approach all over India. I don't think anybody in Punjab, other than a very small fringe, buys it. And their anger is manifesting against BJP, and they're going to do it through the electoral process, which is how it must happen in a democracy.
Fair enough. Aparna, if since you're anticipating a sort of developing situation, what are the red flags? Because, you've heard very passionately, both from Tavleen and Casey, both of whom are Sikhs, apart from being the professionals that they're, and the expertise that they're representing, that they don't believe that the Punjab of 2021 is going to bite. It's not interested. There is discontent, but that discontent is domestic, and that is its manifestation. What are the red flags? What causes you and your co-authors to say, hang on, don't look the other way. This is more intricate. This is better organized. This is better financed. You need to take this seriously. What are the few red flags in the end?
So, yes, I agree with both of them. Our report says that, there is very little support for Khalistan inside India. What we want to say is that hasn't stopped Pakistan from doing what it has done. And that will not stop Pakistan from supporting the groups, whether Pakistan supporting Kashmiri groups or Khalistani groups or groups in India's northeast as it used to, or other places. So Pakistan's deep state will not stop supporting these groups. These groups will also not stop acting. And if these groups are acting in a democracy, in a country where I am working, we want to make sure that the US government is cognizant. And while the US government has normally been cognizant of Islamist radical movements, it has not paid attention to others, like the Khalistani groups. For decades, it ignored them during the Cold War. And even now, there isn't much. So we want
What is the Khalistani, I don't want to use the word movement, but the Khalistani separatist sentiment, the leftover little dribs and drabs of it that may exist in the diaspora. What is it for the Pakistani deep state? And is it just an instrument to eventually get to the end game of Kashmir? We've had Imran Khan, for example, in the past, and many of Pakistan's establishment personas, talk openly to Ghulam Nabi Fai and the delegations he used to lead and the seminars he used to organize at the time.
So it's the policy which they've long called bleeding India by the 1,000 cuts, right?
Yeah.
Keep trying to destabilize, try to act on India's sort of, use India's ethno-linguistic religious diversity against itself. So every fissure, every fault line that you can deepen, that you can create more problems, where you can, exacerbate the problem for India is what the Pakistani deep state has tried.
Yeah, but what is your biggest red flag when it comes to the Khalistan? There are two Ks in this, Kashmir and Khalistan. Why? And your report says, and it's borne out by Tavleen and Casey, that popular groundswell isn't there at all, right? So what is Pakistan betting on?
So I think right now what they're betting on is using this to try and change the sort of American sentiment about India and show that India is not a democracy, or India is a country that does not actually, isn't as free and democratic, that it has movements, that it is suppressing freedoms, that it has these separatist movements which are taking place, which still have resonance. And the diaspora shows that they have resonance. So I think that is what they are trying to do. Sort of, change the narrative about India, change the narrative about India in the US. It may not succeed.
I think Casey's wanting to come in. Casey, brief interjection. Go ahead.
Yeah, very quickly. You see, the Indian ambassador in Washington now is Taranjeet Sandhu. So there's a Sikh, Jat Sikh ambassador, rare, first time ever. And more than that, he's the grandson of the famous Mr. Samundri, after whom the Samundri Hall next to Golden Temple is named. So his grandfather was involved with the Akali movement and the Gurdwara movement. So, he has those antecedents.
Actually, this is the second ambassador who's Sikh.
No, but
Ambassador
Navtej.
Sarna
the
was
earlier
Sikh
one
as well.
wasn't a Jat Sikh. Navtej
Yeah.
was not a Jat Sikh. Taranjeet is rooted in Punjab. Navtej was from Delhi. So Taranjeet, and also Taranjeet's family is connected to Akali politics, going back to his grandfather. So therefore, he has the antecedents. He should use them. I don't think, he should be able to speak to these people from that strength of that legacy.
Yeah. Okay. I've got to close. Before I give Tavleen the last word, Aparna, I would just say the biggest red flag at this time, when you bring in terror financing, what has some of your research shown? Who is funding all of these groups?
So we sort of, all we were able to find out, and this is because, at the end of the day, we are using open source, we are using IRS data, we don't have any details. All we could show is the connection between the groups. We could show that these groups had, for example, similar accountants, that they organized events together. They had similar people on their boards. We don't have the wherewithal to be able to show where the money comes from, whether it comes from outside the country, because that would need to be something that the US law enforcement does.
And that is what you're urging, that investigation.
That is what we are urging them to do, that, sort of undertake an appraisal, apply terror financing laws and regulations to any groups which they believe, are espousing separatist activities, and they see the funding that is coming there, investigate any US-based groups which have potential violation, like with Ghulam Nabi Fai, check these groups. If any of them are getting funds in a similar way, then apply those laws.
Yeah. So, Tavleen, last word to you. Even when Kartarpur Sahib was inaugurated, I happened to be able to go and report. And, the Pakistanis ensured that even in that moment, they were established sort of Khalistani insurgents, sympathizers, members of the lapsed Babbar Khalsa, for example, who were there at the inauguration. And half the time in that Delhi, no one knew who was who, because, we haven't frankly tracked where all these characters have gone. Your last thoughts, you've treated the Sikhs for Justice as these bots who are a waste of time. Do you think that there is something much more insidious going on? Even previous trips to Pakistan, I always remember, Syed Salahuddin, the Kashmiri militant of the Hizbul Mujahideen. It was not uncommon for him to be seen in hotel lobbies of Islamabad with members of the Babbar Khalsa. That's what I remember from younger reporting years. Tavleen, you're on mute.
They are always trying to get the Sikhs to somehow, go against India. Hamid Gul, dreadful man that he was, actually said to me, "You're a Sikh. The Sikhs should have stayed with us, then we would have defeated India." So they have this bizarre idea that somehow if they can get the Sikhs, and there are Sikhs in that Gurdwara near the Lahore, whatever it's called. You go in there are Khalistanis protected by the Pakistani state there. So they exist. What has to happen is for the Indian government to make the mistakes they made last time under Indira Gandhi that led to that, to creation of a fertile. You attack the Akal Takht again, yes, you've got problems. So, basically and you keep making, little Disha Ravi becomes a Khalistani and Greta Thunberg becomes, Pindramwale. Now that is ridiculous stuff. So basically, for me, the red flags are what the government of India is putting up by doing the wrong things. They shouldn't be doing them.
Yeah, I think that's a note which we can end on. Public discontent has to be paid close attention to by any state. Kashmir today is inflammable because of that public anger on the ground, and Punjab cannot be allowed to get inflammable. But thank you, Aparna, for your report, and that interconnectedness between the Kashmiri separatists and the Khalistani sympathizers is very educative. Ambassador K.C. Singh, Dr. Aparna Pande, and Tavleen Singh, thank you so much. Christine, I know you've been hearing this program at the back end. Your internet line has just not been strong enough for us to be able to take you on. So deep apologies, and hope to have you back with us very soon. And to our audience, have a great weekend and see you soon. Goodbye. It's great to see you here. Thank you for watching our work. If you haven't subscribed yet, don't forget to click the bell icon and subscribe to Mojo Story and support independent, robust journalism.